Hello, welcome to our next lecture. This one is going to cover the War of 1812, which lasts from 1812 through 1815. And this is an extremely important and very interesting event because this is going to be one of the first real large-scale major conflicts that the young United States will face, and something that's really going to test its ability to perform as a nation in an international conflict. It's going to be at a much broader scope than something like the Barbary Wars that we talked about previously. And the War of 1812 is going to be really important because it's going to lead to a new sense of unity amongst the American people. So let's first start out with, as we do with all wars here, how does it start? And this conflict is going to be between the United States and Great Britain again. The War of 1812 is sometimes known as the Second American Revolution because the players are the same here. It's going to be the United States versus the British. Although this time it's going to be a battle to maintain that independence that they'd won a few decades earlier. So how does this happen? How does the young United States get into conflict with Britain again? You'd think things would just be over after the War for Independence. They won their independence, it's over. They signed the Treaty of Paris. Everybody should just go home happy. But in this case, conflict is going to arise again with the British. And it starts in the early 1800s with British naval vessels engaging in something known as impressment of American sailors. And the reason that the British are doing this is because they need sailors for their own navy. The British are at war again with France, this time with Napoleon in France. So they need sailors, they need soldiers, they need bodies. So what are they doing? What does impressment mean? Impressment is when you force someone to join your military or join your navy. In this case, what the British are doing is forcibly boarding American ships when they're over in the area around Europe and even some near the American coast. They board the vessels, they grab American sailors and merchants on board, they tie them up as pictured here, and they drag them onto British ships and force them to serve in the British military. American politicians and American citizens are aghast at this happening. They can't believe that the British are just doing this to them, that they are ripping American sailors off of their own ships to use their services and abilities to help the British's war effort with France. People are also pretty horrified at how brazen the British are with doing this. About 6,000 Americans are impressed or forced into the British Navy. Some of them are taken right off the American coast, like right off the coast of Maryland. Others are taken in Europe. There are a lot of trading vessels, American merchant ships over in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic. The British are boarding them, stealing American sailors, and impressing them into the military. There was one American warship that was attacked, and American military members were taken and impressed into the British military. And the reason that the British are doing this is first and foremost, as I mentioned, they did need bodies for their own military to fight their war with France. And the reason the British are picking on the Americans is because they feel that they are easy prey. The Americans are a young nation, not quite as equipped as they possibly could be to defend themselves. They have things in common. They speak the same language. They have the same cultural background. So the British feel that they'll fit right in to the British military. Won't be that much of an initiation period, especially since they're already sailors too. They already know the trade. Sometimes they're already military members. And the British are also going to do it because they realize that Americans are not powerful enough to stop this. They think, what are you possibly going to do, United States? You're so young. You're not as unified as you could be. They're going to simply take advantage of this to their own benefit. So this is the first question. How did conflict with Britain start? So the president at the time when this is getting going is Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was an anti-federalist, which meant that he was adamant that the federal government should not be overly powerful. It should be less powerful than the states. It should not intervene in private affairs or the economy too heavily. He was really a hands-off type of leader. That was what the Anti-Federalists stood for. But this is going to really test Thomas Jefferson's ability to stick to his own beliefs. In 1807, the impressments are rising, and Thomas Jefferson is really concerned with how this looks, that it's making the United States look weak internationally, that their people are being stolen by the British. He thinks that it is something he is also powerless to stop. He realizes the United States probably isn't militarily powerful enough to go up against the British and make them stop doing this. So his solution in 1807 is to pass the Embargo Act. And what the Embargo Act does is it bans all American vessels from sailing to and docking in foreign ports. So any ports in Europe, any ports anywhere, he says, no, you can't go there. He puts an embargo on the ability of American merchant vessels to sail abroad. And the reason Jefferson does this is he's hoping that, well, you can't impress or steal men if they just don't go outside of America. Just keep them domestically. Don't even give them an opportunity to be kidnapped. Just keep them in around the United States. Jefferson's also hoping that by simply keeping sailors away from Europe, that will solve the problem. He's also hoping that maybe by not trading with anybody else, that will hurt other countries' economies and force them to realize Americans are not cool with impressment and make them stop it. However, a lot of merchants end up being hurt. The only people that really end up suffering from the embargo are American merchants. The British don't care, that nobody cares that Americans aren't trading with them. They don't have that much to offer at this point. They're not a very impressive trade partner. So as you can see by this cartoon, this is a famous one regarding the embargo. A lot of merchants refer to it as the cursed "Oh grab me," which very creatively is embargo backwards. And they're talking about how it's what nicks them. It's going after them, the traders. They're the ones that are getting bitten by this embargo act. So in 1809, Thomas Jefferson tries to get a little more specific and make it slightly less punitive, the Embargo Act, and passes the Non-Intercourse Act, which bans trade only with Britain and France, which are the warring nations. Britain is the one stealing American soldiers. France is who is fighting the British. So he says, no, we can't trade with them. Those are the ones that we're banned with trading with. It's seen as a massive overreach of federal power that Thomas Jefferson used his authority to tell American salespeople and merchants that they could not trade with certain countries, specific countries. And Thomas Jefferson leaves office after a second term in 1809. He is at the lowest point of his career when he leaves the presidency. He'll kind of bounce back a bit. He becomes, famous founding father, but he's not very popular when he leaves office in 1809 because of the embargo. He's seen as weak, not being able to do anything to stop it. He's seen as abusing his power by passing the Embargo Act and Non-Intercourse Act. And he's seen as someone who is hurting the ability of merchants to make money. So, all right. Second question here. What was the goal of the Embargo Act? The next president to come into office and inherit all of these problems is James Madison. He's elected in 1809, and now he has a whole mess of troubles to deal with, same ones that Jefferson had. The British impressing sailors and the embargo that Jefferson had in place. So James Madison decides he's going to remove the embargo. It really only seems to be hurting Americans. People aren't even listening to it. The Americans are smuggling stuff in and out of the country. The British show no signs of stopping the impressment. So Madison takes the embargo away. He also puts in a stipulation. He says, okay, look, we're going to stop the embargo, but he sends out a message to the British saying, we will put it back in place if you keep stealing our sailors. And surprise, surprise, in the spring of 1812, the British continue to impress American sailors and kidnap them. So Madison is forced to reinstate the embargo. He does keep his word and he stops trading. He puts the embargo back in place and he tries to stop trade with Britain. And now tensions are really high. You have issues with the British. You still have war going on in Europe. And now you have a president that, with that, while he reinstates that embargo, it makes him seem pretty weak because he just that's the only solution the Americans have is they're just gonna not send their men abroad. They're just gonna keep everybody home because they're not safe outside. It sounds kind of sad and not very impressive. So Madison is faced with a very difficult decision. All right, next question. Why did Madison reinstate the embargo in the spring of 1812? So now Madison, again, as I said, he's faced with a difficult challenge here. He is either going to anger merchants, keep losing money. It doesn't seem to be a winning solution here, but there is a solution being voiced by politicians that become known as war hawks. And the solution of the war hawks is to go to war with Britain and force them to stop impressing the American sailors. And the war hawks get their name from they are the type that want war. Anybody could be a war hawk at any time in history. This isn't unique to the War of 1812. There are many examples of people being war hawks for certain different wars where they're the ones kind of circling and crying that we need to go to war. War is the only solution. That's the only option to take to solve a conflict is to go to war. They're the ones really railing and championing this idea of war. So there are war hawks in the War of 1812 circling and voicing this solution. Let's go to war with Britain again and end this problem. And the war hawks, some of them are, I have a couple images of some of them here. Have House Speaker from Kentucky, Henry Clay. Calhoun was a politician from South Carolina. They were very adamant about why the U.S. should go to war with Britain again. A big one of the war hawks was that this was going to defend national honor. It was embarrassing to just have men kidnapped by another country and not do anything decisive about it. So they wanted to defend national honor and go to war with the British and make them stop. Another big reason the war hawks had for wanting to initiate war with Britain is that they were really hopeful that they would be able to win this war and they'd do really well territorially afterwards. They'd get lots more British land in North America, just like they did during the Revolution. If you remember, the Treaty of Paris gave the Americans a huge, huge chunk of British territory, all of that land west of the Appalachians, the Ohio Valley area that they were drooling over during the French and Indian War. They got a lot of land after winning that conflict. And the Warhawks are very hopeful that they will get more land again if they win against Britain. In this case, they really have their eyes on Canada. They're hoping to fight the British and annex that territory and grow the size of the United States. Some of them find this the most compelling reason to go to war. They're just that adamant that they see this as an excuse to fight the British because they just really, really want Canada. Impressing sailors is secondary to a lot of them. They don't even care about that. The idea of winning Canada, that's special. That's very enticing. Others are adamant that the United States should go to war with Britain because they're accusing the British of inciting conflict with Native Americans, that it's the British that are constantly agitating groups to fight against them. An example of one indigenous group that was against American expansion was the Shawnee on the western frontier, led by Tecumseh, who was embracing this idea of that pan-Indian identity, and of the same one we discussed back when we talked about Pontiac's War, and how with that there was an idea that they wanted to expel white settlers from the territory. People like Tecumseh were calling for attacks on white settlements along the frontier, and a lot of war hawks felt that individuals like Tecumseh were being provided weapons by the British and being agitated by the British because the British wanted to see America fail. They were hoping that they would be able to bring America back as a colony at some point if they floundered and were not successful, and that this agitation by Tecumseh was at the behest of the British. So, a lot of reasons here why they wanted to initiate a conflict. That's the next question. What was the goal of the Warhawks and why did they want war with Britain? All right. So in Madison is faced with a decision. Does he keep the embargo? Does he just turn the other cheek? Or does he agree with the war hawks and go to war with the British? And in June of 1812, Madison decides he's going to ask Congress for a vote to declare war on Britain. He slightly favoring this now. He thinks that this is really the only solution. They've tried a lot of things that have been unsuccessful, like the embargo. This is what's next. However, the vote on the declaration of war passes by only a small margin. And the reason that is that there are a lot of politicians that are not war hawks. They do not agree with the decision to go to war. They do not want to do so. Most of them are worried that the United States simply is not strong enough to fight the British military once again. The United States is too small, too weak, not unified enough, too young, still too inexperienced to be a formidable adversary to a powerful military like the British, who are still very strong. And there are also plenty of people who feel that winning independence, that first conflict with Britain, was just a stroke of luck. Somehow the stars aligned and it worked out in their favor. They might not be so lucky a second time around. So there are plenty of Americans who are very worried that this is a real gamble, that losing this war will mean becoming colonies of the British again and undoing everything that they'd worked so hard for. And the decades of independence that they'd enjoyed since the successful conclusion of the revolution. However, they're still faced with the issue of tension with the British. The declaration of war does pass, and in 1812, the United States is now once again at war with the British. Okay, next question. Why did the declaration of war pass by only a small margin? In other words, why were some people against the war with the British? And surprisingly, well, surprisingly to plenty of Americans, and I maybe the British too, the United States has some early successes. They are victorious several times in some early confrontations with the British. They do enjoy a few victories. Some examples here in September of 1813, the American Navy enjoys a victory on Lake Erie. They managed to defeat the British Navy that they go up against, which was pretty impressive, but they are on home turf. A few months later, in October 1813, there is the Battle of the Thames, or the Thames, if you're pronouncing it the American way here. This is actually future president, William Henry Harrison. Yeah, that one, the one who doesn't last very long in office. William Henry Harrison ends up defeating Tecumseh, the Shawnee individual who was a ally of the British, and Tecumseh's British allies near present-day Detroit. Tecumseh is killed, and this is considered another American victory for eliminating the threat posed by indigenous nations in that western area, the Detroit, Illinois, kind of Great Lakes, upper northwest kind of area, northeast. I don't know what you'd call that. Depends on where you are, relatively. And another victory in March of 1814 is the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Another future president, Andrew Jackson, is pictured here in this drawing. He scores a pretty big win down south in Alabama. He's able to gain some indigenous allies, as dramatized in this image, and leads them against some British allied Native Americans. However, the reason why the Americans are enjoying such great victory in the early days of this war is because the British really aren't that committed to it yet. They are still very much involved in fighting that war with France, the whole reason they needed to impress soldiers in the first place. They're tied up with that. It's only when the French and Napoleon are mostly defeated by 1814 that the British then really fully turn their attention towards dealing with these impetuous little Americans who are trying to fight them once again. So they when they finally do turn their attention to the Americans, it's not going to go well for them. The Americans had kind of gotten full of themselves here. They're thinking, oh, we're doing well. They do have the home front advantage as they had during the Revolution. That hasn't changed. And they also have the ability to make their own supplies. They don't have to wait for reinforcements to come from across the Atlantic like the British do, just like during the Revolution. I mean that this naval victory on Lake Erie, the Americans live right there. They're already there. Their ships are already there. The British have to come and bring their stuff from far away. So these successes were not really indicative of American strength. They were indicative of the British not fully committing yet. So the Americans have this flush of victories in the first few years of the conflict, but that's about to change. All right, next question here. Why were Americans successful in the early years of the War of 1812? So things do the tide turns and not in the favor of the Americans. By August 1814, the British are now able to fully turn their attention against their American adversaries, and they are not going to be very kind about it. In August 1814, now that their attention is not divided, they end up invading the United States. The British arrive in Maryland. They pretty handily defeat the US forces they meet there. They capture the capital city and they set fire to all of the federal buildings in the Capitol. They burn down Washington, D.C. This is extremely embarrassing for the United States. Not only were they invaded, they had their country invaded by a foreign power, but their most important buildings and their most important city were burned down. The president is forced to flee. President James Madison and his family run away. That's really, really not a very good morale builder for the United States, nor is it a good public image to have your leader fleeing in terror from the capital city as foreign troops burn it to the ground. And that's exactly what they do. This is known as the burning of Washington. So the British, they're there, they're in Washington. There's rumors that they probably weren't planning on occupying it. They just wanted to destroy things and ruin the Americans' ability to make war. However, about 4 days later, a very sudden heavy thunderstorm, possibly even a hurricane, they didn't take that good of measurements of what was going on. They had other things on their minds, obviously. This big storm comes in and puts out all of the fires that are burning in Washington, and the British are forced to retreat back to their ships, many of which were very badly damaged in this heavy storm, so it probably was a hurricane to cause that much damage. So the British are they're forced to retreat because of this, and a lot of Americans feel that that was divine intervention, that God had intervened on the part of the United States to save them from any further issues with the British, at least in their beloved capital city. The burning of Washington has two main significances why it's so important for US history and for understanding this conflict. One is that the burning of Washington really angered a lot of Americans. It destroyed their morale to have their beloved capital city burned, to show how weak they were, that this was able to happen in the first place. They weren't able to defend their home soil. They were invaded by a foreign power. It also just it takes the wind right out of their sails. It destroys all of that hope they had in the beginning of the war. It shows that, yeah, those early successes were just a fluke. It was not indicative of their power. It was just it reinforces the notion, makes the Americans realize that, yeah, the British just weren't committed yet. And when they do commit to a war, it's going badly. So a lot of Americans are not confident now for the future of this conflict, that it's going to be totally destructive to the United States. However, it does have another very important impact where it's very defeating, but in the same way, it's actually very unifying and kind of empowering because now Americans are all very invested in this conflict. They're all horrified, they're all embarrassed, they're all angry, and that's going to help push forward a momentum of wanting to now fight this war. Now everybody feels invested in it. The capital city has been burned down. That's horrifying. Foreign troops invaded our soil. That's unforgivable. There were plenty of Americans that really didn't care prior to this about the War of 1812. They're not a merchant. They don't care about shipping. They don't care about impressment. Yeah, it's embarrassing, but it doesn't affect them personally. This feels like a personal attack to many Americans. It shows what a dangerous adversary the British still are. This isn't just skirmishing about trading and or anything like that. This is something that is needs to be fought back against. And a lot of Americans, even veterans of the Revolution, end up enlisting in militias and enlisting in the army to fight the British now that they have something to fight for a really besmirched national honor. If impressment didn't make you fill you with patriotic fervor, then the burning of Washington probably did. All right, next question. What effects did the burning of Washington have on the United States? So the Americans are now full of motivation to fight this war even more strongly. And another conflict is going to occur that's going to be a turning point. It's going to give them a victory that they're going to need, something that's going to prove to be very, very inspiring. And part of the reason why the Americans end up being successful in this is because they do have the home front advantage still, like they did during the Revolution. They're extremely motivated prior to after the post burning of Washington. And the British are going to see with a conflict like this that it's not going to be an easy victory. They were hoping maybe after the burning of Washington that Americans would just fold and give up and surrender and it would all be over quick. But now it's dragging out, and nobody wants to really be a part of this anymore. The British especially, they were if it was easy pickings, they would have been happy. But they're not willing to turn this into another several years, possibly up to decade conflict like the Revolution. So what is this super important tide-turning battle? This is the Battle of Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry is a fort near Baltimore, Maryland, off on the coast there. And in September 1814, Fort McHenry successfully withstands a very brutal British naval bombardment. So Fort McHenry is there. The British want to destroy Fort McHenry so that they can invade Baltimore, Maryland, and carry the war forward, hopefully destroy the Americans' morale, destroy their war-making ability, and end the war quickly and bring Americans back under the domain of the British, or at least wring some concessions out of them that would be favorable to the British. However, Fort McHenry, despite getting absolutely destroyed by the British, it still withstands it. It doesn't fall. It's pretty badly damaged. It's not looking so good, but it's not breached. The British don't destroy it. They're not able to take it away and go past it to invade Maryland. One of the so it's very, very important because the British can't go forward with their planned land assault. They can't go in and invade. Baltimore is not ransacked or destroyed like Washington. It really boosts the American morale. It shows them that the burning of Washington wasn't a sign of imminent failure, and the British start really after this considering peace negotiations because now it's not looking as easy as it once was. The Battle of Fort McHenry is mostly important though because Americans just really see this as more evidence that perhaps God is really looking out for this country and favors them above others. Because there is an individual there, Francis Scott Key, and he witnesses this and he sees that even after that heavy shellacking that Fort McHenry takes, the American flag is still waving. And he's so inspired by this that he writes a little ditty that is known as the Star Spangled Banner. You know, the banner's still waving, if the rocket's red glare, the banner's still there, that one. That's inspired by the War of 1812 and the Battle of Fort McHenry. You know, when it's all over, the flag is still there, that great stuff. So it really becomes a very inspirational moment that, wow, all of that and the flag is still there. That must be very symbolic of some favor from the divine. So the Americans are just flush with victory that they did this, they withstood a heavy assault, and the British are getting a little tired with it. All right, next question. Why was the Battle of Fort McHenry so significant? So the British are willing to come to the negotiating table here, and in December of 1814, the Americans and the British meet in the Netherlands, and they meet in this neutral ground to sign a peace treaty that will end the war, officially stop the fighting, and it's known as the Treaty of Ghent. What the Treaty of Ghent does is it reinstates the status quo from before the war. No territories exchanged, nobody really gains or loses anything, they just kind of agree to stop fighting. It's a military and political draw, really, the War of 1812. No one really wins or loses, they just stop fighting. But Americans see it as a victory. They didn't lose. That's great. They kept their independence. They gambled it against the British and they didn't lose it. So, whew, they're very happy with that. They feel like they can kind of hold their own. So, they're going to take this as a real victory for themselves. Even if it was kind of a draw, well, it was a draw with someone really, really strong. That's not something to simply be tossed out the window. And it does show the British that, yes, they cannot impress American sailors anymore. Americans will fight back. And those Americans are pretty strong. They held their own with the British. So things are back to normal now. Everybody's happy, right? Perfect. All right. Question before I forget. What did the Treaty of Ghent do? Uh-oh, we have another battle to talk about. What? I thought the war was over. Surprise, it isn't. It is over on paper, but things are slow in the early 1800s. Word does not get around very easily or quickly. It takes a while. It's on horseback, by ship, people walking, you carry a message, handwritten. It takes a while for news to get around. So it turns out that way down yonder in New Orleans, nobody has heard that the war is over yet. And the British forces that are down there in New Orleans do not know that there is no more war to fight. So in January of 1815, that's why this war stretches to 1815, the British are planning to invade New Orleans. And this they go in, their plan is to go in and do the same thing that they were going to do to Baltimore or to do to Washington. They want to invade and ransack it. The American forces down there going up against the British attempting to invade New Orleans are commanded by Major General Andrew Jackson, hero of Horseshoe Bend. And Jackson is able to very soundly defeat this attempted British invasion of New Orleans. So it's a real tangible American victory here. The Battle of New Orleans doesn't really change the fate of the War of 1812 at all. But what it does, why it matters, even though it's kind of a last minute thing, the reason the Battle of New Orleans is so important is because now, even though the war had already been won, it showed Americans that even if they hadn't signed the Treaty of Ghent, even if the British kept pushing this fight further, they were going to do just fine because Jackson, who's pictured here, does really soundly defeat the British. They're thinking this is a good sign. Even if we kept fighting the war, we would have done great. It makes Americans feel that they had that step up, that they were the unquestioned winners of the War of 1812. A lot of Americans at the time consider the Battle of New Orleans what ends the War of 1812. It ends with an American victory. They are able to weave the story as one of unquestioned American dominance, that they were able to hold their own, repel this invasion. This is a heroic end to the conflict. It's not quite the handshake draw that the Treaty of Ghent was. This is coming out on top. This is a real strong victory. It's also important because some Americans at the time speculated that if the British had invaded New Orleans and destroyed it, the Treaty of Ghent might have been thrown out the window, that nobody would have wanted to listen to it. The Americans would have been very angry and wanted to retaliate if the British had invaded, and the British might not have wanted to stop now that they were seeing another success. So there is some concern that if the Americans had lost the Battle of New Orleans, it might have reignited the war and dragged it on even longer. So it's able to end the conflict in a decisive way that makes Americans feel that they're pretty much on top of the world. And after this very important conflict comes to an end, it's going to usher in an era of political unity and pride in being an American that is going to be fairly unrivaled in the history of the United States, something known as the era of good feelings, because of there's so little political discord going on. People really are very pleased after this. Americans feel that they've secured their independence, that the revolution wasn't just a one-time thing. They can hold their own, and they're very, very happy about that. Final question. Why was the Battle of New Orleans so significant? So this sets up the United States for an era of ascendancy where they're going to become stronger and more powerful. And the next lecture is going to cover how industrialization and changes in the economy are going to help that as well. So that is where we will follow up with the theme of industrial revolution in the United States.